In the spring of 1943, the British military dressed up a dead man, gave him a fake identity, chained a briefcase full of lies to his wrist, and dropped him into the Atlantic Ocean. And it worked. What followed was one of the most audacious, most creative, and frankly most bizarre deception operations in the history of warfare. It changed the course of World War II. It saved thousands of lives. And it was built entirely on a foundation of fiction, a made-up man, a made-up mission, and a made-up life, complete with a made-up girlfriend and a made-up overdraft at the bank. This is the story of Operation Mincemeat. By early 1943, the tide of World War II was beginning to shift. The Allies had driven the Axis forces out of North Africa. The next logical step was an invasion of Europe, and the most obvious jumping-off point was Sicily, a large island sitting just off the toe of Italy's boot. Sicily made perfect strategic sense. It was close, it was well-positioned. Capturing it would open up the Mediterranean, threaten mainland Italy, and potentially knock Italy out of the war altogether. The problem? It was obvious. Almost too obvious. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command knew the Allies needed to move into southern Europe. They knew Sicily was the most logical target. And if they knew that, they'd fortify it. They'd mass their troops, their tanks, their artillery, and an Allied landing could turn into a catastrophe. The Allied commanders needed a way to convince Nazi Germany that the invasion was coming somewhere, anywhere else. Enter a man named Ewan Montagu and a man named Charles Cholmondeley, and the most elaborate practical joke in military history. Ewan Montagu was a British naval intelligence officer. Charles Cholmondeley worked for MI5. Both were assigned to the 20 Committee, the British deception unit responsible for double agents and disinformation. The idea they came up with wasn't entirely original. It had actually been sketched out years earlier in a memo by a junior intelligence officer named Ian Fleming. Yes, that Ian Fleming, the man who would later create James Bond. The memo described a concept called the Trout Memo, which floated the idea of planting false documents on a dead body and letting the enemy find them. Montagu and Cholmondeley took that seed of an idea and turned it into something real. The plan was this: find a dead body, dress it in the uniform of a British Royal Marines officer, give it a convincing fake identity, and attach a briefcase containing top-secret letters. Letters that would suggest the real Allied invasion target wasn't Sicily, but somewhere else entirely. Then drop the body into the sea near the coast of Spain, where German intelligence was known to be active, and hope that the documents made their way to Berlin. Simple, right? Of course, the details were anything but. The first challenge was finding a body. This sounds grim, because it is. But the team needed someone whose cause of death could plausibly pass as drowning, so that a Spanish autopsy wouldn't raise red flags. After searching through records with the help of a coroner named Sir Bernard Spilsbury, they settled on a man named Glyndwr Michael. Michael was a Welsh vagrant who had died in London in January 1943, likely from ingesting rat poison. His death was quiet, unnoticed, and he had no family to speak of who might ask questions. With the permission of the coroner, his body was quietly requisitioned by British intelligence. Now, they had a body. Next, they needed a life. They created Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. And here's the part that still astonishes me. They didn't just give him a name and a uniform. They built him an entire existence. Major Martin had a father. They wrote a letter from him, fussy and disapproving. He had a fiancée named Pam. They found a real woman, a clerk at MI5 named Jean Leslie, who agreed to be photographed for the role. They wrote love letters between Martin and Pam, tender and personal. the kind of letters you write when you're afraid you might not come home. They gave him a receipt for an engagement ring, an overdraft notice from his bank, because Martin, like many young men, was a little bad with money. A couple of ticket stubs from a London theater, a letter from his father, a stern note from his bank manager. Each item was chosen deliberately, aged slightly, and worn to look lived in. Everything was designed to make Major Martin feel real, not just to a casual observer, but to a trained intelligence officer running a careful analysis. The critical documents themselves were written by the 20 Committee and signed off at the highest levels. They were letters between senior Allied generals, including one from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye to General Harold Alexander, which casually but unmistakably implied that the real Allied invasion targets were Greece and Sardinia. Sicily, the letters suggested, was merely a decoy. On April 19, 1943, the British submarine HMS Seraph slipped quietly through the Strait of Gibraltar and headed for the Spanish coast. On board was a canister packed with dry ice, containing the body of Major William Martin, or rather, Glinder Michael, dressed in his uniform, his briefcase chained to his wrist, his pockets full of the carefully constructed debris of a life. In the early hours of April 30th, just over a mile off the coast of Huelva in southwestern Spain, the canister was brought to the surface. The submarine's crew, most of whom had no idea what was actually in the container, were told it was a secret weather device. Commander Bill Jewell knew the truth. Almost no one else did. The body was slipped into the water. The tide and the current, carefully calculated in advance by British naval experts, carried it toward shore. It was found that morning by a Spanish fisherman named José Antonio Rey Maria. Now the waiting began. Spain in 1943 was officially neutral, but it was a complicated kind of neutral. General Francisco Franco's fascist government had warm ties to Nazi Germany. Franco owed Hitler a significant debt for support during the Spanish Civil War. And Huelva, specifically, was a hotbed of German intelligence activity, run by a particularly effective Nazi spy named Adolf Klaus. When the body of Major Martin was recovered and handed over to Spanish naval authorities, the British began the delicate work of making sure the documents ended up in German hands, while also maintaining the appearance that they desperately wanted the briefcase back. The British naval attaché in Madrid formally and urgently requested the return of the documents. The Spanish authorities, after an appropriate delay, handed back the briefcase. But British codebreakers, reading intercepted messages, could already tell what had happened in the meantime. The briefcase had been opened. The letters had been read, photographed, and passed to German intelligence. And the photographs had gone to Berlin. Major Martin had delivered his message. What happened next was exactly what Montagu and Cholmondeley had dared to hope for. The documents landed on the desk of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr. German military intelligence. Canaris believed them. He passed them up the chain, and they reached Hitler himself. Hitler, already inclined toward suspicion and already expecting Allied trickery, was paradoxically convinced. The documents confirmed what some German commanders had argued, that Greece and Sardinia were the real targets. He ordered significant reinforcements to both locations. Crucially, he also personally ordered that the Panzer Division that had been stationed in Sicily be transferred to Greece. Let that sink in. Because of a dead Welsh vagrant in a borrowed uniform with a fake overdraft notice in his pocket, Hitler moved his tanks away from the actual invasion target. On July 9, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. They faced a fraction of the resistance they would have encountered had the Germans been properly prepared. The campaign, though costly, was a success. Sicily fell in 38 days. Winston Churchill, receiving the news that the deception had worked, reportedly sent a simple message: mincemeat swallowed whole. Operation Mincemeat remained classified for years after the war. The men and women who pulled it off couldn't talk about it. The true identity of Major William Martin, Glyndwr Michael, wasn't publicly confirmed until 1998, more than 50 years later. Ewan Montague eventually told the story in a 1953 book called The Man Who Never Was, which was later adapted into a film. But even then, he kept certain details obscured to protect sources and methods, and to protect the real identity of the body. It's worth pausing on that for a moment. Glyndwr Michael, a homeless man who died alone and unnoticed in wartime London, was given a grave in Huelva, Spain, under the name Major William Martin. For decades, flowers were placed on that grave by people who thought they were honoring a fallen British officer. In a way, they were, just not in the way they imagined. In 1998, when the truth was finally officially confirmed, a new plaque was added to the grave. It reads, Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, R.M. He got his name back, more than half a century later. Here's the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about Operation Mincemeat. It worked not because of some brilliant technical trick. It worked because of psychology. The team understood something fundamental about how human beings, including trained intelligence analysts, evaluate information. We don't just look at the data. We look for the story. We look for the texture of reality. And reality is messy. Reality has love letters and overdue bills and theater ticket stubs. A fake document on its own might be questioned. But a fake document attached to a man who has a worried father and an impatient fiancée and a bank that keeps sending him notices, that feels real. That feels like a person. And when something feels like a person, we lower our guard. The Germans were looking for a trick. They examined the documents carefully. They looked for signs of forgery. They found none. What they didn't account for was that the entire context, the whole human life surrounding the documents, was part of the deception. It's a lesson that goes well beyond wartime espionage. The most effective lies aren't the ones that are hardest to disprove. They're the ones that are easiest to believe. Operation Mincemeat is one of those stories that feels almost too good to be true, too clever, too strange, too perfectly constructed. A dead man in a borrowed uniform, carrying a borrowed name and a borrowed life, changing the outcome of the Second World War. But it's all real. Every detail. The love letters were real. The overdraft notice was real. The body was real. The grave in Huelva is real, and you can visit it today. And somewhere in the ledger of history, in the gap between what happened and what could have happened, there are thousands of lives that weren't lost because a group of remarkably creative British intelligence officers asked themselves a genuinely insane question. What if we could make the enemy trust a dead man? As it turned out, they could. If you want to dig deeper into this story, I'd highly recommend Ben McIntyre's book, Operation Mincemeat. It's the definitive account, meticulously researched and genuinely unput-downable. There's also a 2022 Netflix film adaptation of the same name starring Colin Firth, which is excellent. Links to both in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. There are plenty more stranger-than-fiction history stories coming, and I'll see you in the next one.